It took 7 years for the truth to catch up with me. 7 long, agonizing years of believing that my wife's lost memory and ruined mind were nothing more than a devastating accident. A cruel twist of fate that stole the brilliant, vibrant woman I loved and left behind a quiet, fragile shell. But yesterday, everything changed. My son and I took her to see a new neurologist. When my son stepped into the hallway to take an urgent business call, the doctor leaned across his desk, completely devoid of color, looked me dead in the eye, and whispered 4 words that shattered my reality. "Keep her away from your son." Before I could process what he meant, before I could even open my mouth to ask, the door clicked open. My son walked back in, holding something in his hand, and, in that split second, my heart stopped beating. My name is Victor Caldwell. I'm a 70-year-old retired structural engineer, and I am still trying to process the nightmare my life has become. For 40 years, I built bridges and high-rise, commercial structures all across the country, firmly believing that a solid foundation could weather absolutely any storm. I spent my whole life working to provide for my family, building a safe fortress for my wife and our only child. But I never realized that the most devastating collapse would happen inside my own home, orchestrated by the very blood I spent a lifetime protecting. Dr. Gregory Lynn's office was cold as ice, the air heavy with the sharp, clinical smell of disinfectant and rubbing alcohol. I sat on a rigid plastic chair, holding my wife Diane's frail hand. She's 68, but the past 7 years of suffering made her look so much older. She sat in her wheelchair beside me, staring blankly at a generic medical poster on the wall. Her fingers were completely limp in my palm. She was physically there, but her brilliant mind had been locked in a dark, impenetrable fog for 7 long years. Standing on the other side of her wheelchair was Preston. My 40 wheelchair was Preston, my 40-year-old son. He was wearing an immaculate, tailored navy suit, his hair perfectly styled, his heavy luxury watch catching the harsh fluorescent light overhead. He looked every bit the cold, wildly successful hedge fund manager he had become. To anyone else in that room, he was the absolute picture of a devoted, loving son taking time out of his insane schedule to accompany his aging parents to yet another specialist. Dr. Lynn sat behind his desk, staring intensely at his computer monitor. We were there for what I thought was a routine follow-up. I had been praying that this highly recommended specialist might offer some experimental treatment or fresh insight into Diane's deteriorating condition. A week prior, Dr. Lynn had ordered a comprehensive toxicology and blood panel, far more thorough than anything our previous doctors had ever requested. I watched the doctor closely. The silence stretched, becoming heavy and suffocating. The only sound was the rapid clicking of his mouse. He didn't speak. He just kept reading line after line of data, his brow furrowing deeper with every scroll. I could see the muscles in his jaw clenching tightly. Suddenly, the phone in Preston's chest pocket buzzed loudly. He pulled it out, glanced at the glowing screen, and let out an annoyed sigh. He apologized, saying it was his Chicago office and that he needed to take it. He patted his mother gently on the shoulder, gave my arm a reassuring squeeze, and stepped out into the hallway, pulling the heavy wooden door shut behind him. The second that heavy brass latch clicked into place, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted. Dr. Lynn spun around from his monitor. The polite, calm, professional demeanor he had maintained vanished completely. All the color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, dead gray. He pushed his chair back, stood up, and took 2 quick steps toward me. He didn't speak at a normal volume. He leaned in so close I could feel the tense heat radiating off him. He glanced frantically at the closed door, looked down at my helpless wife, and then stared straight into my eyes. "Victor," he whispered, his voice trembling with a raw urgency that sent a chill straight down my spine. "I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you not to react." I froze, my mind scrambling to comprehend what was happening, but my voice was completely trapped in my throat. "You need to get her out of your house," the doctor continued in a raspy, barely audible breath that felt like a deafening alarm in my ears. "I am looking at her toxicology reports right now. Victor, you need to keep your wife away from your son." The air was knocked right out of my lungs. Keep her away from Preston? What on earth was he talking about? My brain instantly rejected the words. Preston was the one paying for her expensive homescare. Preston was the one meticulously handling all her daily medications. Preston was the perfect, devoted son who visited every single day. I opened my mouth to demand an explanation, to ask if the doctor had completely lost his mind. But before I could utter a single syllable, the brass handle turned. Dr. Lin instantly snapped back, grabbing a clipboard off the counter and pretending to review it with extreme medical focus. The door swung open and Preston walked back into the room. He slipped his expensive phone back into his pocket, wearing that same flawless, reassuring smile. But it wasn't his smile that made my blood run cold. It was what he was holding in his other hand. It was a tall, red, stainless steel thermos. The paint near the lid was slightly chipped from years of daily use. It was an entirely ordinary object, something I had seen 1,000 times. But after hearing the doctor's terrifying warning, seeing it made my stomach drop into a violent knot. "All taken care of," Preston said smoothly, pulling out a chair to sit beside us. "Sorry about that, Dad. The financial markets don't wait." He unscrewed the top of the red thermos. A faint, earthy, slightly metallic scent wafted out, hanging in the sterile air of the clinic. "Time for your herbal blend, Mom," Preston said. His voice was soft, melodic, dripping with absolute patience. He slowly raised the thermos toward Diane's dry lips. For 7 long years, I had watched this exact routine. I had watched it with a heart full of desperate gratitude, thankful to have a son who cared so deeply for his broken mother. But now, with Dr. Lin's desperate warning screaming in my head, every single move Preston made felt calculated, heavy, and horribly wrong. Diane didn't look at him. She remained blankly staring at the wall, lost in the dark mist of her own mind. But as the cold metal rim of the thermos touched her lower lip, something happened. It wasn't a conscious movement, but a primal, visceral recoil. Her weak hand suddenly jerked upward, pushing the heavy red thermos away from her face. The sudden movement caused the thick, dark liquid to slosh over the rim. Several large drops splashed directly onto my bare wrist. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself not to pull back or yell out. The liquid was warm, but the moment it seeped onto my skin, it caused a strange, sharp, burning sensation. The sting went deep, like a harsh chemical, irritating an open wound. I looked down at my wrist, watching the dark stain absorb into my pores. And my mind was yanked back 7 years to a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I remembered the sickening, heavy thud that echoed through our hallway. I remembered rushing out in a blind panic to find my brilliant, dynamic Diane collapsed at the bottom of our oak staircase. That fall had shattered her skull, ultimately destroying her mind. Ever since that day, Ever since she returned home from the hospital, as a confused, terrified shell of herself, Preston had stepped in. He personally researched and prepared this thick, dark plant mixture, serving it to her every single afternoon, rain or shine. He claimed it was an expensive, holistic therapy meant to soothe her damaged neural pathways. I had never questioned it once. I was just an exhausted, grieving husband trying to keep my world from falling apart. But as an engineer, I knew that a fresh coat of paint can hide a crumbling foundation for only so long. Structural cracks always make noise before the final collapse. Sitting in that cold exam room, feeling the chemical burn on my wrist and looking into the terrified eyes of Dr. Lin, I realized my entire family was a house on the verge of a catastrophic cave-in. I looked up at Preston's face. He was using a pristine white handkerchief to dab the spilled liquid off Diane's chin, his movements gentle and meticulous. But there was a tightness in his jaw, a cold, dead focus in his eyes that I had never truly noticed until this exact moment. He wasn't looking at her like a loving son. He looked like a man managing a problem he needed to keep under control. "Everything okay, Dad?" Preston asked, catching my stare. His voice was steady, perfectly innocent. I forced the muscles in my face to relax. I forced a tired, clueless smile, the smile of a heartbroken old man completely reliant on his successful son. "Yeah, Preston," I said, my voice steady despite the hurricane of panic tearing through my chest. "Everything's fine. Just feeling a bit tired today." "Good," he muttered, turning his icy gaze back to his mother. "Come on, Mom. Drink up. It's all for your own good." I sat in the sterile silence, watching my wife swallow the dark liquid, feeling the burn on my wrist pulse like a warning flare. I didn't say another word. I just watched. The old engineer in me was officially awake. The blueprints of my life had been forged, and I was going to tear down every wall until I found out who I signed off on destroying my family. The elevator ride down to the underground parking garage was a suffocating masterclass in forced composure. Preston pushed his mother's wheelchair with practiced ease, looking every bit the dutiful son as he navigated the crowded corridors, using his free hand to reply to work emails on his phone. I walked a few paces behind them, my mind racing. The subtle burn on my wrist throbbed beneath my shirt cuff, a constant, physical reminder of the doctor's whispered warning. "Keep her away from your son." The phrase looped relentlessly in my mind, drowning out the ambient noise of the hospital. We reached Preston's luxury SUV, a massive, spotless black vehicle that smelled of expensive leather and total control. He lifted Diane out of her wheelchair, murmuring meaningless comforts, "Lut," the rain, and buckled her safely into the front passenger seat. She stared straight ahead through the windshield, completely disconnected from the world. I climbed into the back seat, sinking into the plush leather, feeling far more like a prisoner than a father catching a ride with his son. Preston folded the wheelchair, loaded it into the trunk with a heavy thud, and slid into the driver's seat. He started the engine, the motor humming almost silently, and we merged into the afternoon traffic. For the first 15 minutes, the only sound was the low hum of the tires against the asphalt and the soft classical music playing from the car stereo. I stared at the back of Preston's impeccably groomed head. I needed to test the waters. I needed to see how the concrete would react if I tapped on a load-bearing pillar. "Preston," I began, keeping my voice gentle, slightly raspy, playing the part of a tired, overwhelmed old man to perfection. That appointment was a bit unusual, wasn't it? I've never seen a doctor react quite like that to a standard blood panel. Preston glanced at me through the rearview mirror. His eyes were calm, completely devoid of panic or guilt. "What do you mean, Dad?" he asked smoothly, keeping his attention casually on the road ahead. "Doctor." Lynn seemed professional to me. A bit rigid, maybe, but capable. I shifted in my seat, rubbing my tingling wrist beneath my sleeve. "He seemed alarmed," I continued, letting genuine parental distress seep into my tone. "Right before you walked back in with the thermos, he turned pale. He was muttering something about the test results. It's worrying, Preston. You know how much I worry about your mother." Preston let out a soft, dismissive chuckle. It was a flawlessly executed sound, designed to make my concerns feel foolish. "Dad, you have to remember that these clinical neurologists are extremely rigid. They look at a chart, see a slight variation that doesn't fit their textbook training, and they freak out. They lack big picture vision." I paused, letting the silence linger for a moment before pushing just a fraction harder. "He seemed particularly interested in what Diane's been consuming," I said, my eyes fixed on the back of his neck. "That blend you make for her. What exactly is in that red thermos?" "Son, you've been making it every single day since she came home from the hospital 7 years ago. I know you said it soothes her nerves, but what are the actual ingredients?" Preston didn't miss a beat. His shoulders didn't tense. He simply reached out and tapped the digital display on the dashboard. "Let's get Valerie on the line," he said, his tone entirely reasonable and cooperative. "She handles the orders for those supplements. She can explain it far better than I can." The phone rang twice through the car speakers before she picked up. Valerie's voice filled the cabin, crisp, energetic, carrying that patronizing sweetness she always used when speaking to me. "Preston, honey, is everything okay? How did the appointment go with the new doctor?" "We're on our way back, Valerie," Preston answered smoothly. "Dad was just asking a few questions about Mom's daily herbal mix," he said. "Dr. Lynn seemed a bit confused by her blood work today." I heard a sharp, exaggerated sigh come through the speakers. It was a heavy, exasperated sound. "Oh, Dad," Valerie said directly to me, "please tell me you aren't letting that arrogant doctor get in your head. I warned you about these conventional specialists. They completely despise any treatment that doesn't allow them to bill your insurance company tens of thousands of dollars." "Valerie, I just want to know what my wife is drinking," I said, maintaining my soft pleading tone. "It's a highly specialized custom Swiss botanical blend, Dad," she explained, a sharp edge of authority entering her voice. "We import it from a private holistic clinic in Geneva. It contains rare adaptogens and neural compounds that you can't even get approved by the rigid medical boards in this country. It costs us $2,000 a month out of pocket, Dad. But we pay it willingly because it's the only thing that stopped Mom from having those horrific tremors. Do you remember how bad she was before we started this regimen? Do you want her to go back to shaking uncontrollably in bed?" The guilt was deployed with absolute tactical precision. It was designed to make me feel ungrateful, to make me feel completely dependent on their generosity. "We sacrifice so much to keep her stable, Dad," Valerie continued, her voice softening into a fake, wounded affection. "Preston gets up at 5 every morning to measure and mix that liquid down to the milligram. We do it out of love. Don't let some ego-driven clinic doctor ruin all the miraculous progress we've made over the years." I leaned back against the cold leather seat, letting her manufactured guilt wash over me. To an outsider, it was an airtight, bulletproof explanation. I swallowed hard, playing my assigned role to the end. "You're right, Valerie," I murmured, letting my voice sound sufficiently chastened and frail. "I'm sorry. I'm just a scared old man trying to make sense of things beyond my understanding. I appreciate everything you and Preston do for her. I really do." "Thank you, Dad," Valerie replied, her patronizing victory complete. "We'll see you at the house." The call ended, and the SUV fell silent once more. "You don't need to worry, Dad," Preston said softly. "I've got everything under control." I nodded, staring at the back of his tailored suit. But then, my eyes drifted down to the steering wheel. His voice had been so calm, so confident, projecting an image of absolute reassurance, but his hands told a completely different story. Preston was gripping the thick leather wheel with a terrifying, brutal force, his knuckles white as bone. His fingers were locked in a rigid, desperate death grip, his entire forearm trembling with strain against the console. The lie had been absolute perfection, but his body was screaming in raw panic. He knew I was watching, and he was terrified of what I might actually be starting to see. The rest of that evening passed in a suffocating haze of forced normalcy. We arrived back at our sprawling suburban home, a house I had designed and built with my own hands decades ago to be the ultimate sanctuary for my family. Preston helped Diane out of the car, his movements as gentle and precise as a seasoned nurse. He guided her into the living room, settling her into her favorite armchair, draping a soft fleece blanket over her frail shoulders. Valerie was waiting for us, offering a sympathetic smile and a plate of warm food that I forced myself to choke down. They moved around the house with total ownership, managing the care staff, adjusting the thermostat, speaking in low, respectful tones about my wife's tragic condition. To anyone looking through the front window, it was a moving display of intergenerational devotion. But the subtle, persistent sting on my wrist was a constant reminder of the doctor's warning. "Keep her away from your son." I excused myself early, claiming that the emotional toll of the appointment had drained my energy. I retreated to the master bedroom, locking the heavy door behind me, but I didn't even attempt to lie down. I paced the floor in the dark, the silence of the house pressing against me like a physical weight. My mind was a chaotic storm of memories, medical charts, and the image of Preston's white knuckles on the steering wheel. By profession, I was a structural engineer. For 40 years, my instincts kept thousands of people safe. I knew how buildings breathed. I knew how they settled into the soil, and I knew exactly how they collapsed. Someone outside the industry looks at a freshly painted wall and sees a flawless structure. They admire the crown molding and the polished hardwood floors, but an engineer doesn't look at the paint. We listen for microscopic cracks in the concrete. We measure the subtle shifts in the load-bearing pillars. Standing in the dark of my bedroom, I applied that exact logic to my son. Preston had projected a brilliant facade. He was the wealthy hedge fund manager, the dutiful son who stepped up when tragedy struck, the pillar of strength for his aging parents. But the foundation was cracking. The panic in the clinic, the elaborate lie about the Swiss botanical blend, the terrifying grip on the steering wheel, and a doctor who looked like he had seen a ghost. Those weren't minor settling noises. Those were the sounds of snapping rebar. Around midnight, the house finally fell quiet. I heard the muffled sounds of Preston and Valerie retiring to the guest suite down the hall. I waited another 30 minutes, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the study, before silently turning the handle of my bedroom door. I crept down the dimly lit hallway, my socks muffling my footsteps against the hardwood. I paused in the shadows just outside the spacious kitchen. A single pendant light was illuminated above the marble island. Preston was standing there, fully dressed in his trousers and a crisp white shirt, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. In his hand, he held the red thermos. I watched from the darkness as he walked toward the auxiliary medical refrigerator we kept in the pantry. He placed the thermos inside on the top shelf. Then, he did something that made my breath catch in my throat. He pulled a heavy brass padlock from his pocket, looped it through the metal handles of the refrigerator door, and snapped it shut. He slipped the key into his pocket, brushed his hands together, and stared at the appliance with a long, calculated look. Watching him lock that refrigerator sent a deep, agonizing memory surfacing from the past. 7 years ago, in the chaotic aftermath of Diane's fall, my entire world had stopped. She was in a medically induced coma, her brain swollen, her life hanging by a thread. I couldn't leave her bedside. I was a broken man, incapable of focusing on anything other than the steady beep of her heart monitor. At the time, I was the sole owner and CEO of a multi-million-dollar commercial construction firm. Preston, seeing my absolute desperation, stepped in to handle things. He brought me a temporary power of attorney, urging me, Rain, to sign, so he could manage the day-to-day operations and handle financial obligations while I stayed by my wife's side. I signed without reading a single page. I handed over my life's work because I trusted my son to protect our family. For 7 years, I let him run everything, isolating myself inside this house to act as Diane's primary caregiver. Now, standing in the shadows of my own kitchen, a chilling realization swept over me. Preston didn't lock that refrigerator to keep an expensive holistic remedy from spilling. He locked it to ensure that absolutely no one in this house could ever gain access to what was inside. He was treating that red thermos like a volatile biohazard. That was not a remedy. It was a control mechanism. The intricate, horrific pieces of the puzzle finally snapped together in my mind. The sudden transfer of my company, my wife's absolute isolation from the outside world, and that mysterious dark liquid he refused to let anyone else administer. He had trapped us in a prison of his own making, masking it all behind a profound illusion of filial devotion. I stepped back into my bedroom, my heart pounding at a dangerous new rhythm. The paralyzing grief and confusion that had haunted me since the clinic visit evaporated, replaced by a cold, searing clarity. I was no longer just a frightened, confused old man watching his wife slide into the shadows of dementia. I was a man who realized his home was being actively dismantled from the inside. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my hands. These hands had once raised steel frameworks straight into the sky. They were strong, precise, and fully capable of taking down any twisted structure my son had built around us. I knew I couldn't confront him directly. He held the financial reins, the medical power of attorney, and every legal advantage. If I challenged him now, he would simply tighten the noose, perhaps putting us both away to protect his secret. I had to operate in his arrogant blind spot. He thought I was blind, deaf, and completely dependent on him. He thought I was just another load-bearing pillar he could manipulate. I looked toward the bedroom door, jaw set with absolute resolve. I was going to open that refrigerator. I was going to verify my instincts, and I was going to find out exactly what kind of poison my perfect son was feeding my wife. I waited in the absolute dark until the glowing red numbers on the nightstand clock finally blinked to 2 in the morning. The sprawling house was buried in that heavy, suffocating silence that only arrives in the dead of night. My heart pounded a relentless rhythm against my ribs, a feeling I hadn't experienced since my early years, walking narrow steel beams high above the city skyline. For the past 2 hours, I had sat motionless in the dark, meticulously planning my next move. From the bottom of my old leather duffel, I retrieved a small, sterile glass bottle I normally used for travel medication. I also took a tiny plastic bottle of dark food coloring from a forgotten baking kit Diane had hidden in the closet, along with a thin tension wrench and a curved hook tool from a specialized kit I kept from my days on major construction sites. Back then, managing multi-million-dollar commercial projects meant occasionally bypassing jammed equipment lockboxes when tired foremen inevitably lost their keys. I never dreamed I would be using those exact pick tools in my own home to quietly open a refrigerator. I slipped out of the bedroom, having deliberately removed my hard-soled shoes. Moving down the long hallway in thick wool socks, I stepped with extreme care along the outer edge of the floorboards, where the wood was solidly supported by the structural joists below. I knew every millimeter of this house. I had designed it myself. I knew exactly which board would groan under a heavy step and which would hold my full weight in absolute silence. Navigating the grand oak staircase felt like an agonizing eternity. In the dark, every shifting shadow seemed to stretch with malice, playing tricks on my tired eyes. I reached the ground floor landing and paused, holding my breath, listening intently to the house. Nothing. Just the faint, distant hum of the central air unit kicking on. I slipped into the dark kitchen, silently navigating around the massive marble island, and made a straight line for the auxiliary medical refrigerator tucked deep inside the walk-in pantry. The heavy brass padlock hung firmly from the metal handle, gleaming faintly in the pale moonlight filtering through the high windows. Kneeling on the cold tile, I pulled a small penlight from my pocket, biting down on it to free both my trembling hands for the delicate task ahead. I inserted the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyhole, applying light, steady pressure with my left thumb. With my right hand, I gently slid the curved hook deep into the keyway. The internal mechanism was surprisingly cheap, a standard pin tumbler that offered almost no real resistance to an experienced hand. I felt the first pin bind, then set into place with a subtle click. I moved to the second, then the third. A few seconds later, the internal cylinder gave a soft metallic click and released. I caught the heavy padlock in my palm before it could hit the metal door with a disastrous clatter. Slipping it into my deep pocket, I gently pulled the refrigerator door open. A wave of cool air hit my face. There, sitting alone on the top wire shelf, was the chipped red thermos. I reached out and grasped it tightly. It felt unusually heavy and cold. Unscrewing the metal cap with care, I winced as that faint metallic, deeply earthy scent wafted into the tight space once more. Working as fast as my aging hands allowed, I uncorked the sterile glass bottle and carefully poured about 2 fluid ounces of the thick, dark liquid directly into the vial. I sealed it tightly to ensure no leaks, tucking it deep into my pocket for safekeeping. Carrying the heavy red thermos to the deep kitchen sink, I poured the remaining liquid down the drain, watching it swirl away into the dark pipes. I rinsed the inside thoroughly with cold tap water, making sure no residue remained on the stainless steel walls. I quickly refilled the container with fresh filtered water, meticulously adding 3 drops of the dark food coloring I had brought from upstairs. I shook the new mixture, until its visual cloudiness and opacity perfectly matched Preston's supposed holistic herbal blend. I screwed the lid back on tightly, wiped the exterior clean with a dry dish towel, and tiptoed back into the dark pantry to set it precisely where I had found it. I was reaching deep into my pocket to retrieve the brass padlock when my blood went cold. A sharp, distinct creak echoed from the top of the wooden staircase. Footsteps. Someone in the house was awake. Soft, bare feet moved methodically down the upper hallway, approaching the top of the stairs. Pure panic surged through my chest like an electric shock. I had only seconds to react before being discovered. I frantically looped the brass padlock back through the handle, pressing the shackle down until it snapped shut with a horrifyingly loud metallic click. The approaching footsteps were halfway down the stairs. Now I looked wildly around the moonlit kitchen. There was no time to run to the living room or slip down the hall unnoticed. Backing up quickly, I retreated into the dark depths of the walk-in pantry, pulling the louvered door almost shut, leaving only a tiny sliver to look through. I pressed my back against the cool wooden shelves, hiding behind a long row of tall cereal boxes and canned goods. Holding my breath, I covered my mouth to muffle my heavy, fearful breathing. Through the narrow gap in the door, the overhead kitchen lights suddenly flipped on, flooding the room in harsh, unforgiving brightness. Valerie walked directly into my line of sight. She was wearing a long silk robe, her sharp, calculating features illuminated under the bright lights. She walked straight to the kitchen island, opened a cabinet, and pulled out a glass. Moving to the sink, she turned on the faucet. For one agonizing moment, she froze completely, staring down into the stainless steel basin, right at the spot where I had just rinsed out the contents of the thermos. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that I had successfully washed away every trace of that murky liquid. As a professional engineer, I had spent my life relying on precise calculations, undeniable facts, and structural integrity. I never relied on pure luck. But in that suffocating moment, luck was the only thing standing between me and the catastrophic collapse of our lives. The silence in the house felt heavy, charged with unspoken secrets. I could feel the cold glass vial pressed against my thigh, holding a dark mystery that could unravel everything. I thought of Diane lying helpless upstairs, completely unaware of the chemical prison her own son had locked her in. The sheer scale of the betrayal made me physically sick. I had to stay calm and maintain complete composure. Taking a deep, shaky breath to steady my frayed nerves, I gripped the glass vial in my pocket, holding on to it like a lifeline. Valerie stood there for what felt like an eternity, slowly drinking her water while her eyes scanned the dark corners of the kitchen. She took a step toward the closed pantry door, and my entire body locked up. If she opened it, everything was over. The element of surprise would be gone, and my son would know I was on to him. Thankfully, she stopped. She set the empty glass on the counter, switched off the lights, and walked away. I listened as her footsteps retreated up the stairs, vanishing into the quiet above. I slid down the pantry wall, sitting on the cold tile, clutching the vial. I had the evidence. Now, I needed the absolute truth. The morning light filtered through the heavy drapes, casting long shadows across the floor. I sat in my usual armchair, holding a cup of cold black coffee, waiting for the daily routine to begin. At 9 o'clock sharp, the heavy oak door creaked open. Preston walked in wearing a tailored dark gray suit, radiating the effortless confidence of a man who believed he had total control. In his right hand, he carried the red thermos. I watched him approach Diane's bedside, my heart pounding a steady, painful rhythm. I had to bury my anger behind a mask of tired gratitude, giving him a weak smile, the kind a broken man gives to his savior. Preston offered a look of deep, unsettling pity. He sat on the edge of the mattress, unscrewed the thermos, and poured the dark liquid into a small cup. It was nothing more than colored tap water now, but to Preston, it was his tool of absolute control. I held my breath as he brought the cup to Diane's lips. She swallowed mechanically, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. Preston dabbed her chin with a tissue, a look of quiet satisfaction on his face. He had no idea his carefully constructed illusion had just been compromised. He patted my shoulder, mentioned he had a board meeting in the city, and walked out of the room. I listened as his heavy footsteps faded down the hall, followed by the distant thud of the front door closing. The trap was set. For the rest of the day, I watched my wife with the obsessive focus of an engineer monitoring a stress test. I dismissed the afternoon caregiver early, claiming I wanted some quiet time alone with Diane. Pulling my chair closer, I tracked every breath and every subtle twitch of her muscles. For the first few hours, nothing changed. The heavy fog that had enveloped her for 7 years seemed undisturbed. She lay silent and still, staring at the wall. Doubt began to creep in. What if I was wrong? What if her condition really was just a tragic, irreversible neurological decline? But as the late afternoon sun dipped below the horizon, casting an amber glow across the room, I noticed the first tiny shift. The chronic tremors that usually plagued her hands before dinner were completely gone. Her fingers rested still on the cotton sheets. Her breathing, usually shallow and irregular, deepened into a steady, natural rhythm. The rigid tension in her jaw slowly relaxed. I sat frozen, afraid to make a sound, afraid to break whatever fragile process was happening in her mind. The chemical chain was finally dissolving. I stayed awake long after sunset, refusing to eat or look away for even a second. The house sank into a deep silence, but my mind was racing with a mix of overwhelming hope and sheer terror. I was waiting for a ghost to return to the living world. Time moved agonizingly slow. Midnight passed, then 1 in the morning, then 2. My eyes burned with exhaustion, but I forced them to stay open. The red digits on the nightstand clock flickered in the dark. At 4 in the morning, the unthinkable happened. The silence was shattered by a sharp gasp. I sat bolt upright, my heart jumping into my throat. Diane shifted under the heavy blankets. The slow, mechanical movements of the past 7 years were gone. In a sudden burst of energy, she threw the covers off her chest. I leaned forward, knees hitting the floor by the bed, hands hovering over her trembling shoulders. Diane turned her head toward me. As the faint moonlight fell across her face, my breath caught. The thick, impenetrable fog that had clouded her eyes for 7 years was gone. They were clear, sharp, and focused, but they weren't filled with the warm recognition I had spent thousands of sleepless nights praying for. They were wide, pupils dilated, filled with pure, absolute terror. It was the look of someone waking up to find themselves trapped in a burning building. "Victor," she gasped. "My name," she said. "My name." It was a raspy, fragile whisper, damaged by years of silence, but it was undeniably her voice. The shock was so intense I felt dizzy. I reached out to gently touch her face, to tell her she was safe, to tell her I was right there. Before my fingers could touch her skin, she lunged forward. Her frail hands shot out from the dark, grabbing the collar of my shirt. The desperate strength in her grip was terrifying. She pulled me toward her, her chest heaving with rapid breaths. Her eyes scanned the dark room wildly, searching the shadows as if expecting a predator to leap from the corner. She looked at me, her face contorted in deep anguish. Her lips trembled as she tried to force her vocal cords to work. I leaned in closer, my ear inches from her mouth, completely still. She tightened her desperate grip on my collar, her knuckles pale. "Key," she gasped out. It was a single, broken word pushed out with the last bit of energy she had. "Key." Before I could beg her to keep speaking, a violent racked her body. A violent spasm racked her body. She was struck by a massive, overwhelming headache. Letting out a sharp cry of pain, her hands released my shirt to clutch the sides of her head. Her back arched off the mattress, eyes rolling back as the intense pain short-circuited her recovering brain. Then, just as quickly as she had come back, she collapsed onto the pillows, slipping into a deep, heavy unconsciousness. I was left kneeling on the cold floor, alone, hands trembling violently. The room fell back into a suffocating silence. Key. The word echoed endlessly in my mind. My wife had been locked in a chemical prison, and I had just received the first desperate message from the deep. In that moment, I knew with cold certainty that I would do whatever it took to dismantle my son's schemes, piece by piece, to find out what lock that key belonged to. Pale morning light filtered through the heavy drapes, bringing a sense of impending dread. I hadn't slept a second since Diane collapsed. I sat motionless in the armchair, watching her chest rise and fall. She didn't speak again. The heavy, unnatural sleep had reclaimed her, pulling her back down. But the word she had gasped in the dark was burned into my memory. Key. I repeated it over and over, turning it in my mind like a stone with jagged edges. At 8 sharp, the heavy front door opened. I heard the sharp, fast click of high heels on the hardwood. It was Valerie. She rarely visited this early, especially unannounced. I quickly wiped my face, rubbed my eyes, and put on the mask of a tired, helpless old man before walking into the hall to meet her. Valerie stood in the foyer holding a white pastry box. "Good morning, Dad," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I brought fresh croissants from the bakery downtown. Thought you might need a boost after yesterday." I forced a weak smile, taking the box with trembling hands. "You're very kind, Valerie," I murmured. "I really am exhausted today." I left her in the kitchen and walked back to the master bedroom, leaving the door cracked. A few minutes later, Valerie followed, holding 2 mugs of hot coffee. She stepped inside, her eyes immediately darting to Diane, who was sitting up against the pillows. Diane was quiet, but that absolute rigidity was gone. Her hands rested naturally, her breathing steady. Valerie walked over, setting the coffee on the nightstand. "Good morning, Mom," she said in a sing-song voice. Diane didn't answer, but her head turned. It was a deliberate movement. Her eyes locked directly onto Valerie. The blank stare was completely gone. Instead, a flash of pure awareness crossed my wife's face. Her brow furrowed, and a faint sound came from her throat. Not a word, but a quiet sound of recognition and fear. The reaction was instant. Valerie flinched as if struck. The sweet daughter-in-law persona shattered in less than a second. All the color drained from her face, leaving a sickly gray. She stared at Diane, letting out an audible gasp. "Dad," Valerie stammered, her voice losing its melodic tone entirely. "Has she been like this all morning? Has she moved?" I played my part perfectly, shuffling forward with a look of deep concern. "Like what, Valerie?" I asked, my voice trembling. "She seems a bit calmer today, don't you think?" Maybe the new doctor was right and we should adjust our expectations. Valerie didn't answer. She practically ran out of the bedroom, her heels clicking frantically down the hall. I followed silently, staying in the shadows. I watched as she rushed into the kitchen, going straight for the pantry. She stared at the locked refrigerator, grabbing the handle and tugging hard to make sure the padlock was secure. Then she pulled her phone from her designer bag, her thumbs flying across the screen in a desperate rush. Her entire body trembled with panic. She paced back and forth near the island, biting her thumbnail, waiting for a reply. The trap had been sprung, and the walls were starting to close in. Within 3 hours, the front door opened again. Preston strode into the house, his face a mask of calculated anger, disguised as deep medical concern. He had swapped his suit for casual clothes, looking completely unraveled. Valerie followed closely behind, wringing her hands in anxious display. Preston marched straight into the living room, a heavy manila folder tucked firmly under his arm. "Dad, sit down," he commanded, his voice completely lacking its usual patronizing warmth. It was the sharp tone of an executive delivering a non-negotiable order. I sat slowly on the edge of the sofa, letting my hands shake violently. "What is it, Preston?" I asked, forcing my voice to crack with fear. "Why are you two so upset? Has something happened to your mother?" Preston slammed the thick folder down onto the glass coffee table with aggressive force. He knelt in front of me, placing his hands firmly on my knees. "Dad, I need you to listen to me very carefully," he began, his eyes locking onto mine with intense focus. "Valerie called me this morning. She told me Mommy was showing unusual motor function and increased alertness. I know you think that's a good thing, Dad. I know you want your wife back, but you don't understand what's actually happening." He paused, letting out a heavy, dramatic sigh. "I spoke with Dr. Lin and our specialists in Geneva immediately. This isn't a recovery, Dad. It's a dangerous, late-stage spike. Her damaged neural pathways are misfiring wildly. Sudden alertness is a symptom of an impending, catastrophic episode. The herbal blend isn't enough to suppress it anymore. We have to transfer her tonight." I stared at him, mouth slightly open, feigning horror. "Transfer her where?" I whispered, gripping my trousers. "We secured a bed in a highly specialized, secure facility up north," Preston said rapidly. "They have the necessary equipment and chemical protocols to prevent her brain from shutting down completely. An ambulance will be here at 8 tonight to transport her. It's the only way to save her, Dad. You have to trust me." He slid the manila folder across the glass table toward me. "I just need you to sign these transfer authorizations," he ordered, tapping a silver pen against the paperwork. "It grants me medical power of attorney to facilitate the move and authorizes them to use the heavy sedation required during transport. Just sign on the last page, Dad. We don't have time to waste." Ignoring his tone, I slowly opened the folder. The first 3 pages were standard medical transfer forms. But when I turned to the 4th page, my blood ran cold. Hidden within a paragraph regarding emergency proxy authority was a clause for the permanent transfer of asset management. They weren't just trying to take my wife away. They were attempting to seize every last bit of my remaining wealth. I stared at the heavy black ink on the 4th page of the legal document. Permanent transfer of asset management. The words blurred together as the full scope of his plan became horrifyingly clear. They weren't just sending my wife to a high-security facility to hide her recovery. They were staging a hostile takeover of everything I had left. Preston was using a manufactured medical crisis to force me into signing away my financial independence, my home, and my ability to fight back. If I challenged him now, if I threw these papers in his face and accused him of poisoning his own mother, I would lose everything. He had the medical proxy, the clinical records, and the physical leverage to overpower me. I was a 70-year-old man standing alone against a ruthless corporate predator and his malicious wife. I needed time. I needed a window to trigger the trap I had set, with the glass vial in my pocket. I took a deep, ragged breath, letting the air rattle in my lungs. Slipping the folder from my trembling fingers, it landed on the glass table with a dull thud. I collapsed forward, burying my face in my hands. Forcing my shoulders to shake, I drew on every ounce of real grief and terror I felt for Diane to bring forth tears. When I finally lifted my head, my eyes were bloodshot and overflowing. A long sob broke from my lips. "Preston," I gasped, my voice weak and completely broken. "You can't do this tonight. You can't just take her away from me in the dark like a criminal. She's my wife. She's been my whole world for over 40 years. Preston crossed his arms tightly, his face set in a mask of total impatience. He glanced at Valerie, who rolled her eyes and let out a sharp, irritated sigh. "Dad, we've already discussed this," Preston said, his voice dripping with patronizing fatigue. "This is medically necessary. If we don't move her immediately, she could suffer a fatal aneurysm. The doctor has already arranged a specialized transport team." You aren't thinking logically. You're letting your emotions jeopardize her life." I dropped directly to my knees on the expensive Persian rug. This physical act of submission was my absolute ultimate display of fabricated surrender. I looked up at the two of them playing the role of the helpless, ignorant old fool they so desperately wanted me to be. 3 days, I begged, letting my voice crack with sharp, desperate panic. Give me 3 more days. Let me say goodbye to her in the home we built together. Let me sit by her bed and read her favorite book to her one last time. If you take her away tonight, the shock will kill me. Preston, I swear it will kill me." Valerie stepped forward, looking down at me with sheer disgust. "Preston, we cannot delay the transport. The deposit for the private facility has already been wired. If we wait, we lose the reservation, and your mother could have another episode." "Let him have his 3 days," Preston interrupted smoothly, raising a hand to quiet his wife. He looked down at me, his eyes gleaming with the arrogant thrill of absolute victory. He saw a broken, defeated old man kneeling on the floor, completely bent to his will. He believed his masterfully engineered facade had proven entirely unbreakable. He believed he had won. "I'll call the facility and secure you 72 hours. Dad," Preston continued, his voice adopting that sickeningly reasonable tone once more. "But you must sign the transfer authorizations right now. All of them. I need the legal authority to hold her bed. And I need to finalize the asset management proxy so I can release the funds to pay for her upcoming care. You sign the paperwork tonight, and you get your 3 days for a long, proper goodbye. After that, the ambulance arrives, and you do not interfere. Do we have a deal?" I nodded frantically, wiping wet tears from my face with the back of a trembling hand. "Yes," I whispered. "Yes. Whatever you need, Preston. Just let me keep her here until Friday." Preston snatched the manila folder off the coffee table, pressed it directly into my chest, clicked his expensive silver pen, and shoved it into my palm. I took the heavy pen, letting my fingers fumble clumsily over the smooth metal casing. I opened the folder to the first page. Staring at the yellow sticky notes Valerie had meticulously attached beside every signature line, I took a deep, shaky breath and pressed the pen tip to the paper. In my 40 years running a massive commercial construction firm, I had handled thousands of highly sensitive, multi-million-dollar contracts. In that cutthroat world of commercial real estate, fraudulent paperwork and hostile takeovers were constant threats. To protect myself, I had legally registered a very specific, confidential security measure with my corporate legal team. My legally binding formal signature required the inclusion of my middle initial, M, connected to my last name through a very distinct, unbroken stroke. Any document I signed without that specific middle initial was immediately invalid in the eyes of the law. Categorized by my legal team as a dead variation meant only for draft reviews and non-binding negotiations. Preston knew nothing about this corporate safety net. He had taken over my company only after my retirement and had never bothered to learn the intricate, nuanced details of my personal legal defenses. I moved the pen across the heavy paper, deliberately omitting my middle initial. I signed my first and last name in a jagged, trembling script, making it look like the frantic handwriting of a terrified old man. I flipped through the pages, signing the medical proxy. I turned to the fourth page, stared directly at the permanent asset transfer clause, and signed the invalid variation once again. I repeated the deliberate error on every single line, handing the folder back to my son with a look of helpless defeat. Preston snatched the documents, quickly flipping through to verify the ink was in the correct places. A chilling smile spread across his perfectly groomed face. "Thank you, Dad," he said smoothly. "You made the right choice. We will see you Friday morning with the transport team. Don't do anything foolish." I remained kneeling on the floor, watching Preston and Valerie strut out of the living room. The heavy front door slammed shut behind them, sealing the house in silence. I stayed on my knees, listening to the distant sound of their car pulling out of the driveway. Once the faint hum of the engine faded into the night, the shaking in my hands stopped. The tears on my face dried. I stood up smoothly, rolling my shoulders back. The helpless old man was gone, replaced once again by the calculating engineer. They had given me 3 days. That was all the time I needed to dismantle them completely. The front door had clicked shut. Preston and Valerie were gone. I stood up from the rug. I had exactly 72 hours before that transport team arrived for Diane. I retreated to the master bedroom, where my wife slept deeply, her breathing smooth and natural for the first time in 7 years. The sterile glass vial still burned in my pocket, heavy with the toxic secret that had stolen her mind. The next morning broke with a dim, gray light. I knew Preston too well to believe he would leave us unmonitored. I had built this house, designing every sightline and security angle. But upon taking over my construction empire, Preston had updated the external cameras. I had to assume eyes were watching my every move. During the early morning hours, I played my assigned role to perfection. I shuffled through the kitchen in worn slippers, shoulders slumped in defeat, pouring a cup of black coffee with deliberately shaking hands. Sitting at the island, I stared blankly at the marble countertop, looking every bit like a heartbroken, grieving husband preparing for a final loss. Around 9 o'clock, I began the daily chores that served as my cover. I methodically gathered the kitchen trash, tying the heavy plastic bag shut. Reaching deep into my pocket, my fingers wrapped tightly around the cold glass vial. I carefully transferred it to the inner chest pocket of my heavy wool cardigan, zipping it securely inside. Carrying the heavy trash bag, I shuffled slowly toward the back door. The morning air was biting and crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain. I walked down the paved driveway, with my head down, adopting the sluggish, labored stride of a broken man. I could feel the cold, unblinking lens of the security camera mounted above the garage, tracking my progress. I kept my face hidden, letting the collar of my sweater obscure my expression. The back of our estate bordered a narrow, overgrown alleyway that served the rear entrances of the neighborhood mansions 40 years ago. When I designed the perimeter wall, I intentionally left a tiny, irregular blind spot directly behind a massive ancient oak tree, supporting the far corner of the lot. The thick branches and the angle of the high brick retaining wall created a dense pocket of deep shadow that no camera could penetrate. I walked up to the line of large plastic trash bins resting against the brick wall. Lifting the heavy lid, I tossed the bag inside with a loud, hollow thud. Pausing to take a slow, deep breath, I quickly took 3 steps backward into the dark shadows behind the ancient oak. The alleyway was dead quiet, overgrown with wild ivy and forgotten debris. From the deepest shadow, a figure detached himself from the brick wall. He stepped forward silently, a cold cigar clamped between his teeth. Mike Sullivan was 72 years old, but he still carried the broad, imposing frame of the ruthless private investigator he had been for over 4 decades. We called him Sully. We had grown up together in the same gritty neighborhood and fought in the same trenches. Back when I was erecting commercial high-rises, Sully was the man I called to quietly run background checks on suspicious subcontractors and corrupt city inspectors. He was my oldest and most trusted friend in the world, a man forged in absolute loyalty and relentless tenacity. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Victor," Sully said, in a voice that sounded like coarse sandpaper scraping over gravel. He stayed planted firmly in the concealed darkness. Wearing a faded trench coat with a dark newsboy cap pulled low over his sharp, observant eyes. "I feel like one too, Sully," I whispered, my voice tight with relief and lingering dread. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. I know I didn't give you much information when I called from the burner phone this morning." "You said it was life or death," Sully muttered, shifting the unlit cigar to the other side of his mouth. "In 40 years, you've never used those exact words with me. So, what kind of nightmare are we dealing with?" "My boy, Preston finally crossed a line he can't buy his way back from." I reached into the inner pocket of my heavy wool sweater. My fingers trembled slightly as I pulled out the sterile glass vial. The dark, murky liquid sloshed heavily against the curved glass walls. I held it out into the darkness. Sully stepped forward, his calloused hand wrapping tightly around the small container. He raised it slightly, squinting at the dark fluid. "Preston has been feeding this to Diane every single day for the last 7 years, I explained, forcing my voice to stay steady despite the hurricane of anger in my chest. He told me it was a highly expensive, imported Swiss botanical blend for her neural tremors. But 2 days ago, a new doctor looked at her blood work and practically begged me to keep my wife away from my son. I stole this sample from his locked private refrigerator in the middle of the night." Sully lowered the vial, his sharp eyes locking onto mine with an icy, terrifying intensity. The casual demeanor vanished completely, replaced by the cold, calculating operative I had relied on for decades. "You think he's actively poisoning her?" Sully asked, his gravelly voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You think your own flesh and blood trapped her in a chemical coma?" "I don't just think it, Sully. I know it," I replied, my voice hard as stone. "She woke up last night." The fog cleared for a few terrifying moments. She looked right at me, and she was terrified. This Friday, he's transferring her to a locked facility to cover up what he's done. And he's trying to use the transfer to steal the last dime of my remaining wealth. I gave him a forged signature on the asset papers to buy myself 72 hours. Sully let out a low, dark whistle, slipping the glass vial into the deep pocket of his trench coat. A forged signature. The invalid variation trick from the old downtown plaza contracts. You've always been a clever bastard, Victor. But 72 hours isn't much time to tear down a fortress. That's why I need you. I need a full toxicology screen on this liquid. I can't use any local diagnostic clinics. Preston is deeply connected with the city's medical boards. If I take this to a standard lab, his people will flag my name immediately, and the sample will disappear before it ever hits a microscope. Sully nodded grimly, stepping back into the shadows. "I'll get you the absolute truth, Victor," he whispered, vanishing completely into the damp morning air. I watched Sully disappear into the thick mist before turning back toward the house. My hands were empty, but my mind was filled with a terrifying clarity. I had 72 hours to dismantle the trap my son had built for my family. The first step was securing undeniable proof of his actions within these walls. I couldn't rely solely on a private toxicology report. A chemical analysis would tell me what was in the thermos, but I needed to see exactly how Preston and Valerie operated when they thought no one was watching. I needed eyes in the dark. Later that afternoon, I told Valerie I was driving to the pharmacy to pick up my blood pressure medication. She offered to drive me, her voice dripping with fake concern, but I stubbornly refused, playing the proud, irritable old man, clinging to his last bit of independence. She relented, eager to have the house to herself, to finalize the transport logistics. I drove straight to a specialized electronics retailer on the far outskirts of the city. Bypassing the consumer security aisles entirely, I asked for the manager. A man who had occasionally provided me with covert surveillance equipment during my construction days. I purchased 4 military-grade micro-cameras. These were sophisticated devices smaller than a dime, equipped with ultra-high-definition lenses, thermal night vision, and encrypted wireless transmitters that streamed live footage directly to my tablet. I returned home just at noon. The house was quiet. Valerie was upstairs on a lengthy business call, and Preston was at his corporate office. I knew I had a brief, fragile window of opportunity. Retreating to my basement workbench, I unpacked my tools. For 40 years, I had analyzed structural load paths, designed complex electrical grids, and engineered the hidden nervous systems of massive commercial towers. Wiring a few micro cameras into existing household was remarkably basic work for someone with my background. I disassembled the hardwired smoke detectors I had carefully unscrewed from the ceiling earlier. Meticulously, integrating the micro camera modules directly into the slotted plastic vents of the detector housings, I spliced them seamlessly into the house's continuous electrical current. The devices would never require a battery change. They would record endlessly, completely hidden in plain sight. Moving through the house like a ghost, I worked with silent, deliberate precision. I installed the first modified smoke detector directly above the kitchen island, giving me a perfect, unobstructed view of the auxiliary medical refrigerator. I placed the second camera in my old home office, which Preston had brazenly taken over for his hedge fund work. I placed the third camera in the guest hallway. Finally, I slipped into the master bedroom. Diane was resting quietly. Positioning a footstool near the center of the ceiling, I mounted the fourth camera, angling the microscopic lens to capture the entire bed and the surrounding floor. I swept up every speck of drywall dust, returned the tools to the basement, and retreated to the guest bedroom. Locking the door, I pulled out my tablet and launched the encrypted surveillance software. The screen flickered to life, dividing into 4 crystal-clear quadrants. The audio feeds were remarkably sensitive. For the rest of the afternoon and evening, I sat motionless in my chair, staring intently at the glowing screen. I watched Valerie pace the kitchen while complaining on the phone about the tedious logistics of transferring Diane to the secure facility. I watched Preston return from the city, his posture stiff and arrogant as he walked through my house, pouring himself an expensive scotch in my office. They were completely oblivious to the invisible net I had just cast over them. As night fell, the house sank into darkness. The micro cameras automatically switched to thermal night vision, rendering the rooms in sharp, glowing shades of green and white. I sat in the pitch-black guest room, the tablet's bright display illuminating my tired face. At 2 a.m. sharp, a flash of motion registered on the upper left quadrant. The hallway camera captured 2 glowing thermal silhouettes moving silently toward the master bedroom. It was Preston and Valerie. My heart hammered against my ribs as I quickly tapped the screen to maximize the Semite feed from her room. The heavy wooden door creaked open, and they stepped inside. The room was bathed in the eerie green tint of the night vision lens. Diane lay motionless in bed. Preston stood near the foot of the bed, hands planted firmly on his hips, staring down at his mother without a trace of human empathy. Valerie moved close to the seat stand, inspecting a cluster of medical monitors and pill bottles. The highly sensitive microphones picked up the faint rustle of their clothing. Then Valerie spoke, her voice a sharp, venomous hiss, completely stripped of the sweet tone she used during the day. "The old man is getting suspicious," Valerie whispered harshly, glaring at her husband across the bed. "He asked too many questions in the car yesterday, and that little performance in the living room today. Begging for 3 more days. He's trying to buy time. I know it. He's a pathetic fool, but he isn't completely stupid." Preston let out a soft chuckle, running a hand through his hair. "Let him be suspicious, Valerie. He signed the asset transfer authorizations. We have the legal proxy. In 72 hours, she'll be locked safely in that facility, completely inaccessible, and his entire estate will be under our control permanently. It doesn't matter what he suspects. He has absolutely no power left." Valerie leaned over Diane, her face hovering inches above my helpless wife. I watched the screen in absolute horror as Valerie reached into the deep pocket of her silk robe, pulling out an unlabeled plastic bottle filled with pills. "We can't take any chances now," Valerie hissed, her voice trembling with a dark, malicious urgency. "Did you see her eyes this morning? The blend is wearing off. Give her a triple dose tonight. We cannot let her remember that original will." I felt the blood freeze in my veins. My hands gripped the tablet so tightly, my knuckles turned stark white. The original will. My mind flashed back 7 years. Before Diane's catastrophic fall, she and I had visited our estate attorney to draft a highly specific, ironclad joint will. We had structured it so that if either of us passed away or became medically incapacitated, our entire fortune would bypass Preston completely, placing the assets into an unbreakable trust to protect our wealth from his reckless ambition. We knew he lacked the discipline to manage my empire. Diane was the primary executor. If she regained cognitive function, if she remembered the legal safeguards she had put in place, Preston would lose absolute control of my multi-million-dollar company. He would lose his hedge fund capital and his entire hollow empire. That tragic accident suddenly took on a sinister, monstrous shadow. Had she simply fallen down those stairs, or had she been deliberately pushed? I watched the screen in silent terror as Preston nodded slowly, taking the plastic vial from his wife. He crushed 3 pale tablets with a glass on the nightstand, swept the fine white powder into Diane's feeding cup, and mixed it with water. Forcing the liquid past her lips, he gently massaged her throat to ensure she swallowed every drop. They lingered for a few more minutes, whispering quietly about the upcoming transport, completely unaware that I was recording every single second of their betrayal. When they turned off the lights and left the room, leaving my wife trapped in an unnatural stupor once again, I slumped in my chair. I sat in the pitch-black room, my blood running like ice. The scale of their deception was staggering, but I still needed the chemical proof to complete the puzzle. I needed to know exactly what weapon they were using to steal my wife's mind. The agonizing weight hung over me until the quiet morning hours. At 6:15 sharp, the prepaid burner phone, hidden in my duffel bag, vibrated against the floor. It was a harsh buzzing that shattered the quiet. I snatched the device, pressing it tightly to my ear, without saying a word. I simply waited for the gravelly voice on the other end. "Victor," Sully said, his voice sounding older, heavier, and far grimmer than it had 24 hours ago. "I got the lab results back from my private contact. You need to sit down for this, my friend." "I am sitting down, Sully," I answered, my voice a hollow whisper. "Tell me what was in that thermos. Give it to me straight." I heard the sound of paper rustling, followed by a heavy, angry sigh. "In my 40 years on the street, I've seen some terrible things," Sully began, a tone of raw disgust in his voice. "But this is a special kind of evil. There were 0 botanical ingredients in that liquid you gave me. No Swiss herbal extracts, no holistic adaptogens. It was tap water, dark food coloring, and a lethal, high-potency chemical cocktail." I gripped the phone until the plastic casing cracked under my fingers. "What kind of cocktail, Sully?" I demanded, my chest tightening. "A massive, highly illegal dose of haloperidol," Sully read from the official lab report, stating the clinical name with cold precision. "It's a heavy, first-generation antipsychotic, typically reserved for severe cases in locked psychiatric units. But that isn't even the worst part, Victor. The haloperidol was deliberately laced with trace amounts of heavy metals, lead and mercury derivatives. It's a slow, methodical poison. Administered daily, this specific combination completely suppresses the central nervous system. It fundamentally blocks synaptic transmission, causing severe chronic tremors and placing the human brain's higher cognitive functions into a deep, inescapable chemical coma. Here's my take. This is where the house of cards finally tumbles down." I stopped breathing. The air in the room instantly turned microscopic. My brilliant, vibrant Diane. The woman who could effortlessly calculate structural loads in her head, who spent her weekends painting beautiful watercolor landscapes. She never had early onset dementia. She hadn't suffered irreversible brain damage, from a tragic fall down the oak stairs. She was chemically lobotomized. Preston wasn't treating her tragedy. He was actively creating it. He had trapped his own mother in a drug-induced vegetative state for 7 long years, carefully mimicking the destructive symptoms of late-stage Alzheimer's. He needed her legally incapacitated to maintain absolute control over my construction empire, and he needed me completely consumed by grief and caregiving so I would never look at the books. The horrific reality of the past 7 years crashed down on me like a collapsing steel high-rise. Every single day, Preston walked into this house wearing a tailored suit, wearing a smile of flawless filial devotion. He patted my shoulder, offered empty words of comfort, and watched me weep. Then, he walked into her bedroom and administered the poison stealing her life. He did it all for total control. "Thank you, Sully," I whispered into the receiver. "Send the encrypted files to the secure server address I gave you. Keep a hard copy locked in your life." "And toil. I'll guard it with my life, Victor," Sully replied, his voice hard as iron. "Give that monster what he deserves." The call ended with a sharp click. I set the phone on the nightstand, stood up, and walked over to the window, staring out over the estate's sprawling lawn. The sun was just breaking the horizon, casting a bright, utterly deceptive cheerfulness over the neighborhood. A sudden, violent pressure built deep in my chest. The walls of the room seemed to tilt and blur. My knees hit the thick rug, and I pressed my forehead against the cold window glass. Then the dam broke. I dissolved into quiet, racking tears. Silent, devastating sobs tore through my aging frame as my shoulders shook violently. I wept for the 7 years stolen from my wife. I wept for the thousands of dark hours she spent trapped inside her own mind, screaming in silence, while her own flesh and blood forced poison down her throat. I wept for my own complete and catastrophic failure as a father, for raising a monster so devoid of human empathy that he could torture the woman who gave him life. But, as the tears tracked down my weathered face, the burning core of my engineering logic began to harden into something entirely new. Grief was necessary. It was the final purge of the naive, trusting father I used to be. When I finally pulled myself up off the floor, my eyes were bone dry. The tears were completely gone, replaced by a cold, absolute, uncompromising resolve. I knew precisely how to trigger a controlled demolition, and I intended to bring his stolen empire crashing down directly on his head. The morning sun cast long, pale shadows across the manicured lawn. I stood at the window a few minutes longer, letting the freezing reality settle deep into my marrow. My wife was being systematically poisoned under my own roof by our son. I stepped out of the guest room, walked down the long hallway, and stopped at the top of the grand oak staircase. Standing motionless, I stared down at the polished wooden steps. 7 years ago, I found Diane crumpled at the very bottom, a broken heap. Preston was the one who called the ambulance. He told the paramedics she must have tripped over the edge of the Persian rug. For years, I blamed myself, tormented by the thought that I had failed to secure a simple piece of fabric. I let that guilt consume me alive. Now, I saw those steps through a completely different lens. The narrative was shifting, mutating into something far more sinister. Before I could fully process the dark thoughts rising in my mind, the burner phone in my pocket vibrated. Pulling it out, I expected Sully calling with more lab details. Instead, an unknown encrypted number flashed on the screen. I pressed the phone to my ear and stayed completely silent. "Mr. Caldwell," A quiet, tense voice came through the line. It was Dr. Lin, the brilliant young neurologist who had reviewed Diane's blood work 2 days ago and urged me to investigate her decline. "I'm calling you on a secure, untraceable line," he continued, his tone tight with anxiety. "Are you somewhere completely private?" "Yes, Dr. Lin," I replied, stepping back into the room and locking the heavy door behind me. "I'm alone. What did you find?" I heard the heavy rustle of paper over the line. "After you left my clinic, I couldn't stop thinking about your wife's case, Doctor," Lin explained, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. The heavy metal toxicity in her screening made zero medical sense for a standard neurodegenerative condition. It kept me up all night. I knew her primary physician was a close associate of your son, which meant the current medical files were likely compromised. So last night, I bypassed the digital records entirely. I used my administrative clearance to physically access the hospital's deep archives. I went all the way back to the beginning. I pulled the original admission files and the unedited radiological scans from the day she was brought into the emergency room 7 years ago. I held my breath, gripping the edge of the wooden desk. "What did the original scans show?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Dr. Lin let out a long, shaky breath. "When a patient suffers a severe fall down a flight of stairs, the physical trauma presents a very specific, chaotic pattern," he explained meticulously. "We see random contusions, varied fractures along the limbs, and impact injuries consistent with tumbling over multiple angled surfaces. Your wife did suffer those types of secondary injuries. However, the initial impact point, the primary trauma that caused her brain to swell and put her in a coma, didn't come from hitting the wooden steps or the floor below." He paused, the silence heavy on the line. "I isolated the high-resolution skull. X-rays taken in her first hour of admission. Just above the base of her skull, there's a distinct, localized fracture. It's a concentrated point of impact caused by a blunt instrument." I closed my eyes, feeling a wave of absolute nausea wash over me. "Speak plainly, doctor," I commanded, my voice turning to steel. "Tell me exactly what you're implying." The specific fracture pattern at the back of her skull was caused by a direct, heavy blow from a solid cylindrical object, Doctor, Lin stated, his words landing like physical blows. "It happened seconds before the tumbling injuries. Mr. Caldwell, your wife didn't slip on a loose rug. The physical evidence is undeniable. She was violently struck from behind and then thrown down those stairs." The silence in the room became deafening. The 7-year-old puzzle pieces slammed together into a picture of pure, unadulterated evil. Preston hadn't just taken advantage of a tragic accident to steal my fortune. He actively engineered the entire event. He had tried to murder his own mother. When the blow and subsequent fall failed to kill her, leaving her in a vulnerable coma instead, he simply adapted his monstrous plan. He stepped in as the devoted, grieving son, took over her medical proxy, and brought her back to this house. Using his connections, he hired corrupt doctors to keep her locked in a chemical prison, ensuring she could never wake up to testify against him. He lobotomized her with antipsychotics and heavy metals because a dead woman couldn't sign over assets, but a medically incapacitated one could be controlled indefinitely. The sheer, terrifying scale of his sociopathy exceeded anything I could have imagined. He looked me in the eye, embraced me, and watched me weep for my wife, all while knowing he was the one who cracked her skull and threw her into the dark. "I owe you an immeasurable debt of gratitude for your courage, Dr. Lin," I whispered into the phone, all warmth gone from my voice. You risked your career to bring me this truth. When the fallout begins, I'll make sure you're completely protected. Keep those original archive files safe. Do not digitize them, and do not mention this to anyone else. I'll contact you when it's time to move. I ended the call and set the burner phone on the polished desk. Standing alone in the quiet room, I breathed in the cold, stagnant air. The paralyzing grief that had suffocated my soul for 7 years was entirely gone, replaced by a massive, all-consuming fire of absolute retribution. My son wasn't a misguided opportunist. He was a cold-blooded, unrepentant predator who tried to murder his own mother for his bottomless greed. He stole her voice, her mind, and her freedom, locking her in a living nightmare while he strutted through the city, squandering the fortune I built with my own hands. I turned to the window, looking down the long driveway where the transport ambulance was scheduled to arrive in less than 3 days. Preston believed he held every advantage. He was convinced I was a defeated, clueless old man waiting to die. He had no idea that his carefully constructed, stolen empire was about to burn to the ground. I stood motionless, letting the horrific revelation settle into my bones. My wife was brutally assaulted, thrown down the stairs, and then chemically paralyzed by our own son. The crushing weight of this reality almost brought me down, but the fire of retribution kept my mind razor-sharp. As I stared at the locked bedroom door, a single word echoed relentlessly in my consciousness. Key. It was the only word Diane had managed to force past her damaged vocal cords during her brief window of clarity. In the agonizing panic of that night, I thought it was a desperate plea, a request to lock the door and keep her monstrous son out. But Diane was a brilliant, methodical woman with an analytical mind that could rival any forensic accountant. She wouldn't waste her energy on vague pleas. She was giving me a specific, critical instruction. She was telling me exactly where to look. My gaze drifted to the heavy oak wardrobe in the corner of the room. When Preston forced me to move into this guest suite, he carelessly ordered the movers to pack up my belongings alongside some of Diane's oldest, seemingly worthless personal items, things he deemed unfit for his pristine master bedroom. Among those discarded items was her heavy navy wool winter coat. Walking over to the wardrobe, I pulled the heavy garment off its wooden hanger. My trembling fingers traced the dark fabric, feeling the familiar texture of the coat she wore on our walks through the snow. I reached deep into the left inner pocket, pressing my thumb against the heavy seam at the very bottom, searching for the tiny, almost imperceptible slit she had deliberately made decades ago. When my fingers brushed against a small, hard metal object deep inside the hidden fold, my breath caught. Carefully pinching the fabric, I worked the object up through the torn lining until it slid out into my waiting palm. It was a small, intricately carved brass key. Clutching the cold brass, my heart hammered a furious rhythm against my ribs. I knew exactly which lock this key belonged to. I waited, patiently, until late afternoon, monitoring the live feeds on my encrypted tablet. The screen confirmed Preston was firmly planted at his downtown headquarters, while Valerie had driven off to a luxury spa. The massive house was completely empty, shrouded in a heavy, suffocating silence. Slipping out of the guest room, I tiptoed down the carpeted hallway toward my old home office, the room where I had spent countless nights building my commercial construction empire, now brazenly commandeered by Preston for his aggressive hedge fund. Stepping into the space, I ignored the pretentious modern art and imported leather furniture he had installed to erase my legacy. my attention locked onto the floor-to-ceiling oak bookshelves spanning the far wall. 40 years ago, when I originally designed and built this estate, I engineered a highly secure, deeply hidden compartment directly into the foundational framework of the house. It was a structural secret known only to Diane and me. Walking to the far right section of the towering shelves, I dropped to my knees on the hardwood floor. I pressed my hands against the thick decorative wooden baseboard that seamlessly one of the unit, seamlessly along the bottom of the unit. To an untrained eye, it was merely a solid, immovable piece of architecture point. But my hands knew the precise pressure point. Inserting my fingers beneath the subtle lower lip of the oak molding, I pushed upward with steady, deliberate force. A series of dull clicks sounded as the hidden internal latches released. Grasping the edge of the baseboard, I pulled it smoothly away from the wall, exposing a dark, narrow cavity nestled between the floor joists and structural beams. Reaching deep into the dusty, cold darkness of the hidden space, my fingers brushed against the familiar cold steel surface of a heavy lockbox. I grabbed the sturdy metal handle and dragged the heavy container out into the dim light of the office, setting it carefully on the rug to wipe away a thick layer of dust. The lockbox had sat untouched in the dark for 7 long years. Pulling the small brass key from my pocket, I slid it into the narrow keyhole. It fit with absolute precision. Turning the key, the heavy internal mechanism disengaged with a crisp, satisfying click. I flipped back the metal latches and pushed open the heavy steel lid, completely unaware of the horror I was about to uncover. The box was filled with a thick stack of meticulously organized documents, all arranged in Diane's precise handwriting. Drawing out the first bundle from the steel container, my hands shook violently as my eyes scanned the top page. These were comprehensive, highly sensitive bank statements from my commercial construction firm, dated months before Diane's tragic fall. But these weren't the sanitized, heavily altered ledgers Preston had been showing me. These were the original, unedited internal financial records Diane had quietly gathered. Flipping through the heavy pages, I stared in pure horror at an endless sea of red ink. Preston hadn't just made bad business investments, he had been executing a massive, organized embezzlement scheme. The paperwork proved my sons systematically siphoned millions in liquid capital directly from my company's operational accounts. The true scale of his unthinkable betrayal deepened with every page I turned. Preston funneled the stolen millions into his private, wildly reckless hedge fund, desperately chasing massive returns in volatile, offshore markets. The records detailed staggering losses. He had completely wiped out the stolen capital within months. He didn't stop there. In a desperate attempt to cover the massive drain, he leveraged my construction firm's debt-free commercial properties, quietly taking out massive secondary mortgages with severe, punitive terms. The lenders listed on those hidden, unregulated contracts weren't legitimate financial institutions. The documents Diane uncovered proved Preston borrowed millions in high-leverage funds directly from a violent underground criminal syndicate. He had literally mortgaged our family's empire to a ruthless drug cartel to cover his own pathetic failures. Diane had discovered it all. She held the evidence that could completely dismantle his fraudulent kingdom. Preston tried to brutally murder his own mother to cover up his massive theft. When she miraculously survived that violent fall down the stairs, he used chemicals to silence her instead. I stared down at the damning stack of financial ledgers and illegal mortgage contracts, the cold steel of the lockbox pressing into my knees. The air in my home office felt impossibly heavy, charged with the suffocating gravity of a 7-year-old attempted murder. Preston hadn't just betrayed my trust. He broke the most fundamental law of nature, trying to crack his own mother's skull to hide his colossal cartel-backed failures. When her sheer will to live thwarted his lethal push down the oak stairs, he simply turned to chemical warfare, turning her into a silent, vegetative hostage. Carefully placing the undeniable evidence back into the steel container, my hands moved with the precise mechanical efficiency of an engineer setting a demolition sequence. I slid the box back into the dark cavity beneath the floor joists and snapped the heavy oak baseboard perfectly back into place. The physical evidence was finally secure, but the inferno burning in my chest demanded immediate, calculated action. It was the morning of the third day. My 70-hour window was rapidly closing, and the transport team was scheduled to arrive tonight. Retreating to the guest room, I locked the heavy door securely behind me. I brought up the encrypted tablet, watching the glowing grid of live feeds. The house remained dead silent. Valerie had left early for a high society brunch, while Preston was supposedly at his downtown headquarters, though the live feed from my old office proved otherwise. He was sitting behind my mahogany desk, frantically scrolling through his laptop, his face a mask of absolute, paranoid tension. Sweating profusely, he loosened his silk tie while frantically reviewing his shadow accounts. Preston had always been a man consumed by his own fraudulent brilliance, living in constant terror that his house of cards would collapse in a soft breeze. He knew the cartel's patience was running out, and he desperately needed the funds from my estate to appease them. Watching him on the screen, I noticed a nervous, erratic twitch in his jaw as he reviewed the hidden files. I needed to ensure the office audio feed was perfectly calibrated to capture any phone calls he might make to his underground associates. I tapped the high-sensitivity audio sync icon on the glass display. It was a tiny, seemingly insignificant mistake, born of pure, exhausted adrenaline. In my absolute focus, my finger brushed against the diagnostic reset toggle. A sharp gasp escaped my throat as the tablet screen flickered violently. Across the house, on the ceiling of the home office, the micro camera inside the smoke detector suddenly pulsed a bright red light. It blinked twice, casting a brief, ruby beam into the room's dim shadows. Preston froze instantly. His frantic typing came to a dead halt. Slowly raising his head, his dark eyes locked precisely onto the ceiling fixture. The remaining color drained from his face, replaced by a cold, predator-like awakening. He knew that in less than a second, the carefully orchestrated charade we had both been playing had completely evaporated. He stood up slowly, never breaking eye contact with the hidden camera lens. He didn't yell, and he didn't tear the smoke detector from the drywall. He simply smiled, a terrifying, hollow grin stretching across his thin lips, and calmly walked out of the office. The tablet display now showed an empty room, but the silence radiating from the device was deafening. My pulse hammered a violent rhythm against my ribs as I waited for his next move. I knew my son better than anyone in the world. He wouldn't call my phone to negotiate a peaceful surrender. He wouldn't ask for explanations or try to spin another lie. He would instantly accelerate his timeline to eliminate the threat with extreme prejudice. I tucked the encrypted tablet securely beneath the mattress, sliding a heavy steel wrench into the deep pocket of my trousers. Unlocking the guest room door, I stepped out into the long, silent hallway, taking up a defensive position near the top of the grand oak staircase. An agonizing tensions stretched through the rest of the morning. Every tick of the antique grandfather clock in the foyer sounded like a heavy hammer striking an anvil. Listening to the howling wind batter the window panes, I prayed for strength. At noon sharp, the heavy brass deadbolt on the front door clicked sharply. The massive oak door slammed open, rebounding off the wall, with a violent crash that echoed through the entire estate. The polished facade of the loving, grieving son was gone permanently. Preston strode into the grand foyer, his face set in a murderous scowl. Valerie followed nervously, her usual refined arrogance replaced by frantic anxiety. She clutched her designer handbag like a shield, her eyes scanning the empty foyer wildly. They hadn't come alone. Flanking them were two heavily tattooed, physically imposing men dressed in spotless white medical scrubs. They looked nothing like professional psychiatric nurses, moving with the heavy, disciplined stride of seasoned cartel enforcers. Their cold, tactical eyes scanned the layout of the house. Thick muscles bulged beneath their thin cotton sleeves, radiating imminent, lethal violence. The transport team had arrived 8 hours early, and they had zero intention of taking my wife to a legitimate facility. "Dad!" Preston roared, his voice echoing up the staircase with a harsh, metallic edge. "Get down here right now!" I stepped out of the shadows and held my ground at the top of the stairs, looking down at the monsters invading my home. I didn't slouch. I didn't shake. I stood tall, rolled my shoulders back, and let the persona of the frail 70-year-old victim burn to ash. "Looks like your appointment calendar miraculously opened up, Preston," I replied, my voice echoing with absolute, unwavering authority. Preston stared up at me, jaw clenched so tight I could hear his teeth grinding. "The game is over, old man," he snarled, taking an aggressive step onto the bottom stair. "We aren't waiting until tonight. The medical team is taking my mother right now, and you're going to step aside and let them do their job. If you interfere, the nurses have strict orders to medically sedate you for your own safety." I looked past him toward the two hulking enforcers, who were already reaching into their pockets to pull out heavy, preloaded syringes. "They aren't taking her anywhere," I said coldly, gripping the wooden banister with the hand I had spent 40 years using to shape steel and concrete. "She stays right here, and you leave this property right now." Valerie let out a sharp, hysterical laugh, stepping out from behind her husband's broad shoulders. Her expression contorted into a grotesque mask of arrogance and amusement. She wasn't just faking a smile. She was radiating a sickening, triumphant malice. For years, she had played the role of the sweet, loving wife and caregiver, pouring coffee and offering sugary smiles while secretly plotting the demise of the woman who welcomed her into this family. Now, standing in the foyer of the house I paid to build, flanked by enforcers disguised as medical staff, she finally let the venom break through her refined facade. "You're completely delusional, you pathetic old fool," she repeated, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Do you honestly believe you have any power here? You're just a sad little relic standing in our way." She crossed her arms, shifting her weight to one hip, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle of an old man supposedly facing total destruction. She truly believed I had completely broken down, a fragile artifact ready to be swept into the dustbin of history alongside my poisoned wife. I looked past her heavily made-up face and locked my gaze directly on Preston. My son stepped forward, his imposing frame deliberately blocking the entire width of the grand oak staircase. He positioned himself like a prison warden, cutting off any potential retreat or escape route. The two men in spotless medical scrubs mimicked his movements, shifting their weight and slipping their calloused hands into their pockets, their fingers undoubtedly curled around the heavy syringes meant for my wife. The air in the foyer turned thick, heavy with the promise of imminent violence. Preston stared up at me, his dark eyes completely devoid of the boy I raised, the young man I sent to college, or any trace of human empathy. He had fully embraced the monster he cultivated in the shadows. Puffing out his chest, he straightened the collar of his expensive shirt, preparing to deliver the final, crushing blow to the father he despised. He took another step up, closing the physical distance between us, trying to force me into submission with his youth and energy. I didn't flinch. I didn't step back an inch. I stayed anchored to the hardwood floor, channeling 40 years of brutal corporate negotiations into my posture. Seeing that his physical intimidation failed to produce the expected fear, Preston decided to deploy his carefully constructed narrative. Turning his head toward the open front door, he raised his voice to an exaggerated, theatrical volume. He wanted the two enforcers to hear, as well as any neighbors, walking their dogs or checking the mail. "It seems the dementia is completely contagious," Preston announced loudly, his voice bouncing off the vaulted ceiling with a nauseating fake grief. The stress was just too much for his fragile mind. "He's had a complete mental breakdown, Valerie. He needs to go to the facility with Mom. They can share a room and get the specialized care they both desperately need." The sheer audacity of his lie was breathtaking. He was actively laying the groundwork to lock me away permanently alongside Diane. He was painting a tragic, highly believable picture for the outside world. A devoted son, forced to make the painful decision to institutionalize both of his beloved parents due to a rapid, synchronized decline. It was a seamless cover story designed to give him absolute, uncontested control over my entire estate. Valerie nodded along loudly, playing her part in his twisted performance. "It's so heartbreaking, Preston," she called out, projecting her voice toward the open doorway. "We have to do what's best for them, even if they don't understand it." The dramatic performance ended as quickly as it started. The moment those loud words left his mouth, his entire demeanor shifted. The fake sorrow vanished from his eyes, replaced by a cold, calculating malice. He lunged up the final 3 steps with frightening speed, crowding directly into my personal space. Grabbing the fabric of my sweater with both hands, he yanked me forward. I let him pull me, ensuring he felt the illusion of physical dominance. Bringing his face so close, I could smell the stale coffee and bitter mint on his breath. His lips brushed my ear as he whispered a harsh, barely audible threat that drove a spike of pure ice down my spine. "You're going to hand over the original asset documents right now, old man," Preston hissed, his voice vibrating with lethal, unbridled aggression. "I checked the proxy forms you signed. You intentionally messed up the signature block using your invalid corporate variation. Did you really think my lawyers wouldn't spot that pathetic little trick before going to the bank? I know. You have the main titles and original ledgers hidden somewhere in this massive mausoleum. You're going to take me to them right now, and you're going to legally sign them over to me without a single flaw. If you don't comply, the entire story changes tonight." He tightened his violent grip on my collar, his nails digging painfully into my collarbone. "This house has extremely old, unpredictable gas lines, Dad," Preston whispered, every syllable dripping with murderous intent. would be a catastrophic tragedy if a massive explosion leveled the entire property while we were outside processing the transfer. A tragic accident taking the lives of a disabled mother and her frail husband in the middle of the night. What a terrible shame. But these things happen in old homes. No one would ever question a structural failure like that. I stared into the dark, soulless eyes of the man I helped bring into this world, feeling the heavy, cold steel of the wrench resting deep in my trousers pocket. He had just fully confessed to his willingness to burn his own parents alive, simply to cover his staggering financial failures. There was not a single shred of redeemable humanity left inside him. As his breath hit my face, I didn't look away. I needed him completely focused on me, utterly confident in his fabricated advantage. So he wouldn't notice the faint, blinking light of the hidden micro-camera installed in the smoke detector directly above his head. He had just delivered his ultimate murderous threat onto a crystal-clear audio feed that was currently streaming live to my secure offshore server. The trap was now fully sprung. Every leverage point he thought he held had just become completely worthless. Very slowly, I raised my trembling hands in a calculated, highly convincing display of total surrender. "All right, Preston," I whispered, letting a single tear fall. "You win." Preston released his violent grip on my collar. A sickening, utterly triumphant smile spreading across his face. Smoothing down his expensive dress shirt, he took a step back with the arrogant stride of a conqueror who had just seized the ultimate prize. Valerie let out a long, dramatic sigh of relief, tossing her designer handbag onto a nearby chair and crossing her arms. The two hulking enforcers remained entirely still, their cold eyes darting between me and the heavy wooden door leading to the master suite, fully prepared to carry out their grim task. Preston held out his hand, palm up, demanding the physical documents he believed would save his crumbling empire. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. He believed he had won the war. He expected me to drop to my knees, beg for my life, and lead him to the hidden compartment where Diane had stashed the original ledgers. He expected the heartbroken, grieving father he had manipulated for 7 years. I didn't yell, and I certainly didn't beg. Taking a slow, deliberate step back, I created a little space between myself and the predators invading my home, reaching my right hand into my pocket. Preston tensed for a fraction of a second, his dark eyes narrowing, perhaps expecting me to pull out a weapon or a key to a safe. The two men in medical scrubs shifted their weight, reaching deeper into their pockets, ready to plunge lethal syringes into my neck if I made a sudden move. Instead of a weapon, I pulled out my encrypted phone. Holding the sleek glass device in my palm, my thumb rested gently above the main interface. Valerie rolled her eyes, laughing out loud at the device. "Who are you going to call, old man?" she mocked, her voice dripping with pure venom. "The police could never get here in time to save you or your pathetic wife. You're completely alone." I didn't respond to her taunts. Keeping my eyes locked on my son, I maintained the mask of fearful submission while my brain operated with cold, mechanical precision. In one fluid motion, I tapped a specific, pre-programmed sequence into the phone's touchscreen and executed the command. For 3 agonizing seconds, absolutely nothing happened. The grand foyer remained dead silent. Preston let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head in fake pity. He took a step forward, reaching out to snatch the phone from my hand. Then the entire building responded. It started with a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the hardwood floors, causing the crystal chandelier hanging overhead to rattle. A loud, mechanical grinding echoed from deep within the walls of the sprawling house. Before Preston could register the shift, the heavy-duty security mechanisms I had meticulously installed decades ago kicked into gear. Heavy reinforced steel shutters. My own custom, military-grade hurricane design, descended from hidden housings above every window and exterior door. They slammed down with deafening crashes that shook the foundation of the house. The bright afternoon sun was instantly erased, plunging the entire foyer into a harsh, artificial dimness, lit only by faint emergency backup lights. The massive steel plates locked into floor anchors with a series of heavy metallic thuds, sealing the house like an impenetrable fortress. The sudden, violent sensory deprivation triggered immediate panic. Valerie screamed, a high-pitched, piercing sound that echoed off the high ceilings, as she covered her ears and cowered against the wall. The two enforcers pulled sleek black handguns from beneath their scrubs, abandoning the syringes entirely as they looked in every direction for an unseen enemy. Preston froze in the middle of the foyer, his arrogant smile erased and replaced by a mask of raw, unfiltered terror. Spinning around, he stared at the solid steel barrier now covering the massive front door, realizing in an instant that their only escape route was severed. Slowly turning back to face me, the color completely drained from his cheeks as the horrifying reality of his situation finally settled in. "You aren't going anywhere." "Preston," I stated, my voice stripped of its last trace of frailty. The hollow tone I had maintained for 7 years vanished, replaced by the deep, commanding authority of a man who built a construction empire from scratch. Stepping off the stairs, I walked calmly toward the center of the room, posture straight and shoulders broad. I was no longer the prey. I just trapped the predators in a steel cage with me. "What did you do, you crazy old fool?" Preston shouted, his voice cracking with rising panic as he pointed frantically at the armed men. "Open these doors right now, or they will kill you where you stand." I ignored his threat entirely, walking slowly toward the heavy mahogany coffee table in the center of the foyer. Raising my left hand, I methodically unclasped the heavy silver wristwatch I had worn every single day since Diane gave it to me for our 30th anniversary. Tearing the metal band off, I tossed the heavy timepiece onto the polished wood surface of the coffee table. It landed with a sharp click, cutting through the tense silence of the sealed room. I looked directly into my son's panicked eyes, letting the full weight of my retribution crush down on him. "You forgot who built this house, Preston," I said, my voice cold and hard as glacier ice. "I engineered every beam, every wire, and every security protocol in this building to withstand a fragile old man. You aren't facing a fragile old man. You're facing the architect of your entire existence. More importantly, you forgot who I play poker with on Thursday nights." Preston stared at the watch on the table, chest heaving as he struggled to process my words. "That watch is an active, highly encrypted FBI audio transmitter," I explained, pointing at the face. "My old friend Sully isn't just a street informant. He's a retired federal agent with the Financial Crimes Division. Just 12 hours ago, Sully handed your complete, unedited cartel ledgers over to a federal task force. They've been listening to every single word spoken in this room. They heard your murderous threats. They heard your confession regarding embezzlement. And they know exactly who you brought into my home. These steel shutters weren't just meant to keep you inside. They were meant to trap you until the tactical team surrounding this property breaches the perimeter." For a few agonizing seconds, the gravity of my words hung in the stale air of the sealed foyer. Preston stared at the silver wristwatch resting on the mahogany table as if it were a live grenade. The arrogant sneer that defined his adult life melted away, leaving the terrified, trembling face of a cowardly boy, finally caught in a catastrophic lie. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to utter one final desperate threat, but the words withered in his throat. A low, distant wail of sirens began to penetrate the reinforced walls of the estate. It started as a faint whine, but within heartbeats it multiplied and amplified into a deafening chorus of heavy sirens. The piercing sound tore through the quiet, affluent neighborhood, converging directly onto our front lawn. The heavy, rhythmic crunch of armored tires, grinding over the decorative gravel driveway, vibrated up through the floorboards. The tactical response Sully and I orchestrated was no bluff. The full, overwhelming force of the federal government had arrived, ready to dismantle my son's fraudulent kingdom. Realizing they had walked blindly into a coordinated federal trap, the two enforcers lost their composure. Men accustomed to operating in the shadows, intimidating defenseless victims, and enforcing underground debts were entirely unprepared to face a heavily armed tactical unit. Exchanging a panicked look, they dropped their handguns onto the polished, hardwood floor. The weapons landed with heavy clatters, sliding across the room to rest near the baseboard. Slowly raising their tattooed hands high into the air, they laced their fingers behind their heads and dropped to their knees in total surrender. They knew engaging a federal tactical squad would result in their immediate deaths. Valerie let out another shrill scream, collapsing onto the bottom step of the grand oak staircase and burying her face in her hands. Preston, completely abandoned by his hired muscle and cornered by his own monumental arrogance, began to hyperventilate. Turning in frantic, useless circles, he slapped his hands helplessly against the unyielding steel shutters covering the front door. His desperate attempt to find a weakness in my structural engineering was violently interrupted by the mechanically amplified boom of an FBI amplified Degoshan. Crisis negotiator speaking through a heavy loudspeaker outside, commanding everyone inside the residence to drop their weapons and surrender immediately. Calmly pulling my encrypted phone from my pocket, I didn't look at my son clawing helplessly at the steel plates. Keeping my focus entirely on the digital interface, I navigated to the core security control application. I entered the 12-digit alphanumeric override sequence, bypassing the lockdown protocol I had activated just minutes before. Heavy internal gears whirred to life. The massive style shutters covering the front door and surrounding windows unlocked, rising upward with a heavy mechanical hum. Blinding daylight flooded the grand foyer, revealing a terrifying sight. 24 heavily armed federal agents surrounding the entire perimeter. Before the heavy oak doors could swing completely open, the tactical squad surged into the residence under dark Kevlar helmets and the halo of blinding tactical flashlights. The speed of the breach was breathtaking. Crisp, commanding voices filled the space, ordering everyone to the ground as red laser sights painted the chests and foreheads of the intruders. The two enforcers were violently subdued within seconds, heavy zip ties locking their wrists behind them as they were dragged toward the exit. Valerie was yanked from the stairs, screaming incoherently as cold steel handcuffs snapped around her delicate wrists. Preston offered no physical resistance whatsoever. His knees buckled under his weight, and he collapsed onto the expensive Persian rug. Two federal agents immediately descended on him, driving their knees into his back and forcing his arms behind him. As the metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the foyer, The last shred of Preston's allegiance to his wife evaporated. He jerked his neck, looking up at the commanding officer in sheer desperation. "It was all her idea," Preston screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched panic as he nodded wildly toward Valerie. "She arranged the cartel loans. She managed the shell accounts. She made me silence the old woman. I'm completely innocent. I was forced into this." Valerie stopped screaming. The sheer cowardice of his betrayal hit her like a physical strike. She stared at the man she had conspired with, the man she had married for wealth and status, now desperately trying to sacrifice her to save his own skin. A guttural, animalistic roar ripped from deep within her throat. Ignoring the federal agents pinning her arms, Valerie lunged forward. She threw her full weight at Preston, kicking wildly and thrashing her head. "You pathetic, lying coward!" Valerie shrieked, her high heels catching Preston viciously in the ribs. "You pushed her down the stairs. You crushed the pills. You begged the cartel for money to save your pathetic, failing fund. You don't get to pin your miserable failure on me." The federal agents intervened quickly, dragging the struggling woman backward and forcing her toward the open doorway. Preston lay whimpering on the floor, clutching his bruised ribs, completely stripped of his dignity, his power, and his freedom. I walked slowly across the grand foyer, my footsteps echoing with a heavy, absolute finality. I stopped directly in front of the man who tried to murder my wife and steal my legacy. Looking down at him, I felt no pity, no regret, and no sorrow. The purge of my naive, fatherly love was complete. Squatting down slightly, I made sure my face was the only thing he could see. "You thought you were so brilliant, Preston," I said, my voice dropping to a low register that only he could hear beneath the chaotic shouting of the federal agents. "You thought you engineered the perfect, untraceable crime. You thought you could simply silence your mother, keep your father sedated, and walk away with a multi-million-dollar empire to pay for your empty existence. But you fundamentally misunderstood the foundation of this family. You underestimated the intelligence of the woman you tried to kill, and you underestimated the absolute, unforgiving resolve of the man you tried to rob." Preston looked up at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, pathetic hope. Leaning in closer, I delivered the final blow to his shattered reality. "That asset proxy you forced me to sign is legally worthless," I whispered coldly. "I used my designated corporate duress signature. You get absolutely nothing today." He was dragged away, facing massive federal charges of attempted murder, severe elder abuse, and underground racketeering. The heavy, steel doors of the transport van slammed shut, swallowing the frantic screams of the son I had once loved. Standing on the cold gravel of the driveway, I watched the flashing red and blue lights fade into the distance. The suffocating nightmare that had consumed my entire world for 7 long years was finally over. The intense adrenaline rush slowly receded, leaving a profound, echoing exhaustion that settled deep into my bones. The massive estate behind me, once a monument to my success, now felt completely hollow. It was a silent stage of a horrific betrayal, a place poisoned by Preston's relentless greed. I knew I could never live inside those walls again. I simply couldn't bear to walk past the grand oak staircase where my beloved wife had suffered so deeply. Every room in that house was permanently tainted by the echo of their insidious lies. I sold the property the following month, liquidating the physical evidence of his cruelty. I relocated to a quiet coastal property far away from the toxic shadows of the city. The gentle, fresh ocean breezes helped clear my mind and heal my weary soul. I focused every ounce of my energy and resources on the single most important goal left in my life: rebuilding the shattered pieces of my family. The first few days following the arrests were filled with endless meetings alongside federal agents and corporate attorneys. I handed over every single document, every audio recording, and every piece of financial evidence I had gathered. The authorities were stunned by the sheer scale of the embezzlement and the intricate web of deception my son had woven. The legal proceedings that followed were brutal. The prosecution systematically exposed their massive, complex web of deceit. I stood in the crowded courtroom, watching silently as my former son tried desperately to manipulate the jury. He presented countless fabricated stories, trying to paint himself as a tragic victim of unfortunate circumstances. But the unedited financial ledgers and crystal-clear audio recordings completely demolished his fragile defense. Preston and Valerie are currently being held in maximum security detention cells. A federal judge, recognizing the flight risk they posed, firmly denied them bail. They are awaiting their inevitable, lengthy federal prison sentences, stripped of their stolen wealth and fake dignity. The criminal syndicate was completely dismantled by the financial task force, and the assets stolen from my construction firm were meticulously traced, frozen, and fully recovered. I spent countless hours working side by side with federal auditors to rebuild the structural integrity of my company. We purged the toxic elements and restored the foundation of trust with our legitimate partners. My business is now completely secure, standing on solid ground once again. 6 months later, the biting winter air gave way to the bright, forgiving warmth of an early spring morning. Carrying a hot paper cup of coffee in my right hand, I walked through the sliding glass doors of a quiet, sunlit neurological rehabilitation center. The sterile, depressing atmosphere of the previous medical facility was completely gone. This was a healing sanctuary filled with vibrant greenery, open spaces, and professionals who genuinely valued human life. My true victory was waiting for me at the far end of the sunlit hallway. I walked toward the open doorway of a private corner suite, my heart beating with a steady, hopeful rhythm. Diane was sitting in a comfortable armchair by a large window, bathed in the soft golden light of the early morning sun. The pale, lifeless gray that had haunted her delicate features for 7 long years was gone. Her skin had a healthy rosy color, and her posture was relaxed, supported by her own recovering strength rather than artificial restraints. It had taken months of rigorous, exhausting medical intervention to slowly and safely flush the lethal doses of heavy metals and antipsychotics from her fragile system. There were frightening days filled with uncertainty, agonizing moments when I paced the hospital waiting rooms, fearing the chemical damage was permanently irreversible. The doctors had warned me about the unpredictable nature of severe neurological trauma. But my brilliant, resilient wife fought her way back from the suffocating darkness with a quiet, fierce determination that awed me to my core. I stepped quietly into the room. Diane turned her head at the sound. Her eyes, once clouded by a thick, unnatural fog, were completely clear and sparkling with life. They flashed with the sharp, analytical brilliance I had fallen in love with 40 years ago. The profound recognition in her gaze was an absolute miracle. Walking over, I gently placed the warm paper cup on the small table beside her. I had prepared the coffee, exactly the way she liked it, carefully stirring in 2 packets of raw sugar and a splash of cream just as I used to do every single morning before the incident. She looked down at the cup, then slowly reached out her trembling fingers, gently brushing them against my weathered hand. That simple touch sent a deep, healing warmth directly into my soul. Wrapping her fingers around the warm cup, she steadied her grip and carefully raised it to her lips. She took a slow, deliberate sip, closing her eyes for a moment to savor the simple, reclaimed joy of a familiar routine. Setting the cup down, she looked directly into my eyes, a familiar, teasing smile playing on her lips. "Victor, this coffee is a little weak today." A sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion broke through my chest, shattering the last remnants of my stoic exterior. That simple, coherent sentence was the sweetest sound I had ever heard in my entire life. By wrapping my arms gently around her shoulders as hot, silent tears finally slid down my cheeks, I held her close, feeling the steady, reassuring rhythm of her heartbeat against my chest. All the wealth in the world, all the commercial properties and businesses I had ever built, meant nothing compared to this single, perfect moment. We had survived the ultimate betrayal. We had walked through the darkest fires of hell and emerged on the other side completely unbroken. The long, terrifying nightmare was finally over. I knew the road to full recovery would still require immense patience and unwavering devotion, but we would face it together. These tears were no longer born of paralyzing grief or suffocating despair. They were tears of absolute, unfiltered joy. Pressing my forehead against hers, I breathed in the scent of her hair and listened to the steady rhythm of her breathing. I had lost a monster, a cruel, irredeemable predator, who had disguised himself as my own flesh and blood. But in the ashes of that devastating betrayal, I fought the hardest battle of my life, and I won back my brilliant, irreplaceable wife. We're going to leave this city entirely. We'll find a small house by the ocean, where the air is pure and the past can never reach us again.